In the spring of 146 before the Common Era, the greatest city of the Mediterranean world stood on the edge of oblivion. Carthage, jewel of North Africa, mistress of commerce, home to 500,000 souls prepared to face annihilation at the hands of an enemy that had pursued her destruction for more than a century. The city gleamed white against the azure waters of the Gulf of Tunis, her harbors. One circular and military, the other rectangular and commercial, could shelter over 220 vessels simultaneously. Behind walls 40 feet high and 30 feet thick, the Carthaginians had built a civilization that predated Rome itself. Founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre in the 8th century, before the Common Era, Carthage had grown from a trading post into an empire that controlled Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the entire North African coast from modern Libya to the Pillars of Hercules. But empires built on commerce and sea power rarely survive confrontation with empires built on legions and land conquest. The rivalry between Carthage and Rome had been inevitable, two powers sharing the same sea, competing for the same resources, driven by fundamentally incompatible visions of Mediterranean supremacy. They had fought 3 wars across more than a century, conflicts so brutal and transformative that history would remember them simply as the Punic Wars. From the Roman name for the Phoenicians, Pini, the First War had lasted 23 years, ending in 241 before the Common Era with Carthaginian defeat and the loss of Sicily. The Second War had been even more devastating. Hannibal Barca, perhaps the greatest military mind of antiquity, had led Carthaginian armies across the Alps with war elephants, crushed Roman legions at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, and prowled the Italian countryside for 16 years. Yet even Hannibal's genius could not overcome Rome's inexhaustible reserves of manpower. The Romans learned, adapted, and eventually drove him from Italy. The war ended in 201 before the Common Era, with another Carthaginian defeat, this time more humiliating. Crushing war reparations, surrender of all territories outside Africa, and reduction to a client state forbidden from making war without Roman permission. For 50 years, Carthage paid her indemnity and focused on rebuilding. She transformed herself from a military power into a purely commercial one, and prosperity returned. Her merchants traded in the harbors of Alexandria, Athens, and even Rome itself. Her agricultural hinterlands, rich with olive groves and grain fields, fed populations across the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians paid their final war indemnity installment to Rome in 151 before the Common Era, 50 years to the day after the treaty's signing. They believed freedom had finally arrived. They were catastrophically wrong. In Rome, an elderly senator named Marcus Porcius Cato had spent those 50 years nurturing an obsession. Cato, the Elder, as history would call him, ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the same 5 Latin words: Carthago delinda est. Carthage must be destroyed. According to the Roman historian Plutarch, writing 2 centuries later, Cato once brought fresh figs to the Senate, allowing them to fall from his toga. When senators admired their quality and freshness, Cato revealed they had been picked in Carthage just 3 days earlier, demonstrating that Rome's ancient enemy remained dangerously close, wealthy, and potentially threatening. Whether this theatrical moment truly occurred matters less than what it represented: Rome's pathological inability to tolerate Carthage's continued existence. The final war, the Third Punic War, began in 149 before the Common Era on a manufactured pretext. Carthage's North African rival, Numidia, had provoked border incidents for years. When Carthage finally defended herself militarily without Roman permission, Rome declared this a treaty violation and demanded impossible terms. First, 300 hostages from noble families. Then, surrender of all weapons and armor. The Carthaginians complied with both, desperate to avoid war. Then Rome revealed the true demand: abandon Carthage and rebuild at least 10 miles from the sea. For a maritime civilization, this was a death sentence disguised as mercy. The Roman demand reached Carthage in the early summer of 149 before the Common Era, delivered by consuls Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus, to a city that had already disarmed itself in good faith. The envoys stood before the Carthaginian Council of Elders and pronounced what they surely believed would be the final chapter of Carthaginian history: evacuate the city, move inland beyond sight of the sea that had made Carthage great, and Rome would permit the people to survive as landlocked farmers. The reaction was not submission, but fury, beyond Roman calculation. Carthage had surrendered her weapons, delivered her children as hostages, accepted every humiliation, and now discovered that Rome's appetite for degradation was infinite. The city exploded in rage. Carthaginians tore at their clothes and faces in anguish. Some attacked the Italian merchants still residing in the city, killing them in the streets. The council messengers who had negotiated with Rome were seized by mobs and executed as traitors, their bodies dragged through the commercial harbor. Then, impossibly, the disarmed city chose war. What followed was one of history's most desperate improvisations. Carthage had perhaps 30 days before the Roman legions already landed on African shores would begin their siege. The city transformed every public building into a weapons factory. The great temples of Baal, Hammon, and Tannet became forges. Aristocratic women cut their hair to provide cordage for catapults, since Carthage had surrendered all her rope along with her weapons. According to the ancient historian Appian of Alexandria, whose account provides our most detailed narrative of these events, the Carthaginians manufactured 100 shields, 300 swords, 1,000 catapult projectiles, and 500 spears and javelins every single day. A freed slave named Hasdrubal, not to be confused with the earlier Barcid generals, emerged as military commander, taking charge of the desperate defense. Under his leadership, the Carthaginians armed approximately 30,000 men, a remarkable feat for a city that had surrendered every weapon just weeks before. They conscripted slaves, promising freedom in exchange for military service. They armed women and elderly men. They prepared to defend every street, every building, every inch of their civilization. The Roman army that arrived to besiege Carthage numbered approximately 80,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, the largest military force Rome had assembled since Hannibal's invasion. Consuls Manilius and Censorinus expected swift victory against a defenseless population. Instead, they confronted walls 40 feet high and 30 feet thick, defended by a population that had chosen collective death over abandonment of their city. The siege began in the summer of 149 before the Common Era and immediately became a catastrophe for Rome. The massive walls, which enclosed nearly 23 miles of territory, proved impregnable to direct assault. When Romans attempted to storm the defenses, Carthaginians poured burning oil from the ramparts and launched missiles from hastily manufactured catapults. When Romans tried to blockade the harbors, Carthaginian crews cut through the harbor chains at night and raided Roman supply ships. When Romans attempted to build siege ramps, Carthaginian sappers undermined them. For 2 years, the siege ground forward with agonizing slowness. 2 consuls came and failed. The Roman Senate, frustrated and embarrassed, searched for a commander capable of ending the war. They found him in the adopted grandson of the very general who had defeated Hannibal, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus. At 37 years old, Scipio Aemilianus was technically too young to serve as consul. But the Senate bent its own rules and appointed him commander of the African campaign in 147 before the Common Era. Scipio Aemilianus brought methodical brutality to the siege. He constructed a massive fortification wall around Carthage, sealing off land access completely. He built a stone causeway across the harbor entrance, choking off maritime supply routes. He systematically captured the surrounding towns, eliminating any possibility of relief forces reaching the besieged city. Carthage was now completely isolated, and starvation became Rome's most effective weapon. By the spring of 146 before the Common Era, Carthage was dying. 3 years of siege had reduced the once magnificent city to a nightmare of starvation and disease. The population, which had numbered 500,000 at the siege's beginning, had been reduced to perhaps 50,000 survivors clinging to life within the massive walls. Corpses filled the streets faster than the living could bury them. Plague swept through the cramped quarters. Parents watched children waste away. The great warehouses that had once overflowed with grain from the African interior now stood empty, their stores exhausted months earlier. Yet still, impossibly, Carthage refused to surrender. The city's defenders, now skeletal figures barely capable of holding weapons, continued manning the walls. Hasdrubal, who had declared himself king during the siege, maintained iron discipline through terror, executing anyone who spoke of capitulation. The Carthaginians understood perfectly what awaited them. Rome had made clear from the beginning that this was a war of extinction, not conquest. Scipio Aemilianos, observing the deteriorating conditions within the city, prepared for the final assault. He had spent months studying the defenses, identifying weak points, and assembling specialized assault forces. In the early spring of 146, he ordered the attack to commence. Roman legionaries stormed across the causeway Scipio had built into the military harbor. The weakened Carthaginian defenders, starving and exhausted, could not hold. By nightfall of the first day, Roman forces had breached the harbor walls and poured into the lower city. But taking the harbor district proved only the beginning. Carthage had been built across three distinct elevations, with the Baessa, massive, fortified citadel, towering above the commercial and residential quarters. Every street, every building, every rooftop became a battlefield. The fighting that followed was unlike anything in Roman military experience. Carthaginian families turned their homes into fortresses. Romans advancing through the narrow streets faced missiles from every window, burning oil from every rooftop. When legionaries cleared one building, defenders retreated to the next, fighting from house to house, room to room. The battle was three-dimensional. Romans had to fight upward toward the Baessa, while simultaneously securing buildings on either side to prevent being attacked from behind. For 6 days and nights, the street fighting continued without pause, according to Appian, whose history provides the most detailed account of the assault. Roman soldiers became so exhausted that Scipio instituted shifts, rotating fresh troops into combat every few hours while allowing others to rest. The Carthaginians, having no reserves to rotate, fought until they collapsed from exhaustion, wounds, or starvation. Roman engineers set fire to buildings they could not quickly clear, creating an inferno that consumed entire neighborhoods. The narrow streets became corridors of flame. Smoke choked the spring sky. Screams of burning civilians merged with the clash of weapons and the collapse of burning structures. As buildings fell, corpses both fresh and those that had lain in the streets for weeks were buried under rubble, then subsequently burned in the fires. The stench, according to ancient accounts, was beyond description. By the 6th day, Roma forces had fought their way to the base of the Baessa. The final 50,000 Carthaginian survivors, mostly civilians who had fled the lower city, crowded into the massive citadel complex atop the hill. The temple of Eshmun, Carthage's god of healing, stood at the Baessa's summit, its columns visible across the burning city. Here, with nowhere left to retreat, the defense finally collapsed. Hasdrubal, who had spent 3 years promising to fight to the death, abandoned his people at the final moment. The Carthaginian commander, who had executed others for suggesting surrender, now crept from the Baessa's under cover of darkness and threw himself at Scipio's feet, begging for his life. The Roman general, disgusted by this cowardice, granted the request. Hasdrubal would live to be paraded in Rome's triumph. Inside the temple, Hasdrubal's wife learned of her husband's betrayal. What followed would become one of antiquity's most powerful images of defiance in the face of annihilation. Hasdrubal's wife stood atop the temple of Eshmun with her 2 young children as flames consumed Carthage below. Roman soldiers surrounded the Baessa, and escape was impossible. The commander who had pledged to defend Carthage to his last breath now cowered under Roman protection. According to Appian's account, she called down to her husband, ensuring her voice carried across the Roman lines, "Wretch, traitor, most effeminate of men. This fire will entomb me and my children. But you, who will lead the procession of a Roman triumph, what temple will hide the infamy of your shame?" She then clasped her children close, walked into the burning temple, and disappeared into the flames. This act of defiant suicide captured the imagination of ancient writers and has resonated through history as the final gesture of Carthaginian pride, choosing self-annihilation over Roman mercy. The remaining Carthaginians in the Baessa, approximately 50,000 souls, surrendered shortly after. They emerged from the citadel starving, broken, barely human. Roman soldiers separated them into categories. Useful slaves, mostly women and children, would be sold. Men of military age would be executed or worked to death in mines. Few aristocrats would be preserved for Scipio's triumph in Rome. Hasdrubal himself was spared as promised, to be paraded as a prize before jeering Roman crowds. With organized resistance eliminated, Scipio Aemilianus ordered the systematic destruction of Carthage. What the battle had not burned, Roman engineers demolished. The magnificent harbor facilities that had made Carthage a commercial power were torn down stone by stone. The massive walls that had withstood 3 years of siege were leveled. The great temples of Balhaman and Tanit, which had dominated the city's skyline for centuries, were reduced to rubble. The wealthy villas of the aristocratic quarter, the merchant warehouses of the commercial district, the public forums and bath complexes all were systematically obliterated. The destruction continued for 17 days. Every standing structure was pulled down. Roman soldiers combed through the ruins, extracting anything of value: bronze fittings, marble columns, decorative elements. These spoils, along with Carthage's considerable treasury, were shipped to Rome. The famous Library of Carthage, which had rivaled Alexandria's in size and contained Punic works on agriculture, navigation, and literature, was dispersed. Most Punic texts were lost forever. Rome had little interest in preserving the literature of a people they had chosen to erase. Once the physical city was destroyed, Roman priests performed ritual curses over the ruins. The precise details of these ceremonies remain debated, but ancient sources describe religious rituals intended to render the site uninhabitable forever, dedicating the land to infernal gods. The most famous element of Carthage's destruction, the claim that Romans plowed salt into the earth to ensure nothing would grow, appears to be a later invention. This dramatic image first appears in scholarly literature only in the 19th century and has no basis in ancient sources. Nevertheless, the symbolism captured something true. Rome did not merely conquer Carthage, attempted to unmake it from history itself. The Roman Senate formally declared Carthaginian territory the province of Africa, forbidding anyone from rebuilding on the site of Carthage itself. The surrounding agricultural land, which had made the city wealthy, was parceled out to Roman veterans and African allies, where Carthage had stood. The Senate mandated that only wild land should remain a monument to the consequences of challenging Rome. The genocide was nearly complete. Of Carthage's 500,000 inhabitants, perhaps 50,000 survived as slaves. The Punic language would persist in rural North Africa for centuries, but Punic culture, literature, and identity were effectively extinguished. The civilization that had produced Hannibal, that had contested Rome for dominance of the Mediterranean, that had existed for 7 centuries, was annihilated in the spring of 146 before the Common Era. Yet Rome's victory, though absolute, carried within it the seeds of imperial corruption that would eventually consume the Republic itself. The fall of Carthage marked a transformation in Roman character as profound as any military defeat could have accomplished. The Republic that had once fought defensive wars against Carthaginian aggression had become an empire willing to erase entire civilizations to eliminate potential rivals. Scipio Aemilianus himself, standing amid the burning ruins, allegedly wept and quoted Homer: "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." When his companion Polybius, the Greek historian who witnessed the destruction, asked why Scipio wept at the moment of his greatest triumph, the general replied that he feared Rome would one day suffer the same fate. His premonition proved prophetic, though not in the way he imagined. Rome would not fall to a rival empire for centuries. Instead, the victory over Carthage accelerated moral and political decay within Rome itself. The enormous wealth seized from Carthage and other conquered territories flooded into Rome, creating grotesque inequality. The small farmer soldiers who had formed the backbone of Republican virtue were increasingly displaced by latifundia massive agricultural estates worked by slaves. The Senate, once a deliberative body balancing competing interests, became a corrupt oligarchy where political decisions were bought and sold. Within a generation of Carthage's destruction, Rome's republican system began its death spiral. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus would be murdered by senatorial factions for proposing land reform. Gaius Marius would transform the legions from citizen militias into professional armies loyal to individual commanders rather than the state. Civil wars would convulse the Republic as generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar used their legions to settle political disputes. The Principate of Augustus, beginning just a century after Carthage's fall, would replace the Republic with autocracy. Ancient observers drew explicit connections between Carthage's destruction and Rome's moral collapse. The historian Sallust, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, argued that fear of Carthage had kept Roman society disciplined and virtuous. With that external threat eliminated, Romans turned their competitive energies inward, resulting in the civil wars that destroyed the Republic. Whether this analysis oversimplifies complex historical forces remains debatable, but the chronological correlation is undeniable. For centuries after its destruction, Carthage existed only as ruins and a cautionary tale. The Roman prohibition on rebuilding was eventually lifted. Julius Caesar proposed a colony on the site, and Augustus actually established one in the late 1st century before the Common Era. This new Carthage became a prosperous Roman city, eventually serving as capital of the African provinces and an early center of Christianity. St. Augustine of Hippo studied in Roman Carthage in the 4th century of the Common Era, yet this was a fundamentally different city, speaking Latin rather than Punic, worshipping Roman and later Christian gods, bearing only geographical connection to the civilization that had preceded it. The original Carthage was almost completely erased from history. Because Romans destroyed Carthaginian literature and contemporary accounts were written by Greek and Roman observers hostile to Carthage, we know Punic civilization largely through the eyes of its enemies. The Carthaginians left behind no historical narratives, no philosophical treatises, no literary masterpieces. Their technological achievements in ship construction, harbor engineering, and agricultural techniques are documented primarily in fragments preserved by Roman writers who found them useful. We know Hannibal as a military genius, but have almost nothing written from the Carthaginian perspective about his campaigns, his motivations, or his ultimate goals. Modern historians have attempted reconstruction based on archaeology, linguistic analysis of Punic inscriptions, and critical reading of hostile sources. These efforts reveal glimpses of a sophisticated culture practiced in maritime trade, skilled in agricultural management, and capable of producing remarkable individuals. But the portrait remains fragmentary, shadowy, a civilization understood primarily through its absence. The destruction of Carthage stands as perhaps antiquity's clearest example of genocidal policy. A conscious decision to eliminate not just a political rival, but an entire culture. It succeeded. Today, when people speak of total war, of unconditional surrender, of refusing to negotiate with enemies, they invoke principles Rome perfected at Carthage and, which Scipio Aemilianus saw, even in his moment of triumph, would ultimately consume the civilization that employed them.